Gotcha.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my Tempered Nergigante guide. Nergigante is an Elder Dragon, so you have a very high chance of earning a Hero's Streamstones. Those are used for Rarity 8 weapons. You also have a fair chance of earning a Rarity 8 decoration as well, but as you probably know, farming the threat level 2 monsters actually give you a greater chance of Rarity 8 decorations. So usually you're going to be fighting a Tempered Elder Dragon if you're interested in that Hero Streamstone, but also if you're interested in having a chance of earning an Elder Dragon gem. Since we're talking about Tempered Nergigante, that means we're going to have a limited number of flash pods to use against him, so we're going to be talking a little bit about that as we go along. There's a lot to point out when we take a look at the Hunter's Notes for Nergigante. Let's start out by looking a little bit at the hit zones. You'll notice his horns and his tail can be broken, right? You can sever his tail. Then we talk about which weapons are most effective on his body parts. It says his head is weakest to hammers, his body is weakest to blades, and one of the things we're going to be talking about is kind of like a strategy for where you should be hitting Nergigante. He's kind of a unique monster in the way that, well, kind of what he does is, as you're fighting him, you're going to trigger spikes to grow on his body, right? And I've learned a lot about that. I did a lot of kind of like analysis and experimentation on him over a while now in order to make this video. One of the things that's really interesting about Nergigante is he seems to grow spikes wherever he takes damage, meaning if you don't damage a part of his body, he actually won't grow spikes there. And the spikes have an interesting attribute to them. Once they're grown, they appear to become a weak spot, right? So weapons that are going to be dealing critical damage are usually advantageous for this. And, let me mention something else. His horns are actually going to be able to deflect your weapon if it's not a white sharpness on the weapon. So one of the things you're really going to be focusing on here with Nergigante is striking his head. You know, when the horns break, you're going to get 2 flinches. When you attack his spikes, you're actually building up to being able to break those spikes off, which is one of the main goals when you're fighting Nergigante. So if you can break his spikes off, a lot of the time he's going to become KO'd. He's actually going to become knocked over. Then you're going to be able to group up on him and really focus on another part of his body that's growing spikes, right? Well, when we get back to that issue of him growing spikes where he takes damage, if you focus on his head more than any other part of his body, you can see that's a great weak spot to be focusing on. And you're going to be able to break his horns for the flinch. You're going to be able to break the spikes for the KO. So one of the things I'm going to be recommending is everybody, especially on a team, everybody kind of ignores his tail, kind of avoids his wings to some degree, really just focus on his head. And there's a whole lot of reasons why that's a good idea. We'll be going into detail over all of that. But yeah, so his head and his forearms are considered weak spots, but really it's anywhere where he grows. Spikes are going to be, suspect to taking weak spot damage and therefore getting that crit damage in. When we take a look at the elements, you'll notice he's weakest to thunder. You can take dragon as well. I'm not too worried about that. I guess if you're using a weapon that's really good with elemental damage, you'll consider using thunder. With the ailments are really interesting. He actually has a 2-star weakness to sleep and paralysis. That's not very common for end game monsters. Usually you see that they have a 1-star weakness to sleep or a 1-star weakness to paralysis. He actually has a 2-star to both. And so let me just mention, if somebody does put him to sleep, be sure that you take full advantage of that. Don't just wake him up. If you're a bow user, you need to be careful. If you see him going to sleep, stop using your moves. You're going to accidentally wake him. When he goes to sleep, everybody just piles their barrels around him and then let the person with the strongest attack wake him up. And then, of course, the other option, paralysis. 2-star weakness to paralysis. Maybe you can get 3 procs off on him. That would be really useful for your team in order for them to kind of focus on that one part of his body where they're trying to break the spikes before they finish growing. And why don't we move on to talking a little bit more about those spikes, right? So the white spikes, they've got a lot of small characteristics that you actually have to take time to examine. So the first thing, I always thought the way the spikes worked is that they just randomly start growing, and that's not really the case. when you hurt Nergigante's body part that grows spikes, he'll start growing those spikes shortly afterwards. What's interesting is if you don't attack him at all, he'll still grow spikes, but the way it's going to work is he's going to use one of his moves, and it appears the spikes will grow there shortly afterwards. So I think what's going on is Nergigante actually hurts himself with some of his moves. Or maybe he doesn't deal damage to himself, but he deals part break damage to himself. I'm not 100% sure, obviously. I can't see how the code was written or anything. But yeah, so one of the things that led me to believe this is I saw him use a kind of like a shoulder charge shortly after spikes started growing. The other thing I tried doing was I would attack him and see if the spikes would grow on that part of his body, and of course they did. And one of the last thing, and I didn't get this captured, but I witnessed it more than one time, is he'll have spikes on his wings that I deal damage to, but I don't break them off. And then he'll actually use his shoulder charge, and they actually break off when he uses his shoulder charge. And this is what leads me to believe that he at least deals part break damage to himself. Another interesting thing about the spikes is that you can actually start attacking them pretty early. So you'll notice raised bumps on his skin, and that's where the spikes are growing. They're actually growing in there. And if you were to attack them very efficiently, you'll notice the bumps actually get broken off. However, when this happens, it doesn't seem to affect him like when the spikes have emerged and they're white. When they've emerged and they're white and you break them off, he usually gets knocked over from that, right? A KO. But if you knock them away when they're still under his skin, it doesn't seem to really react to it. You'll just notice his skin becomes smooth again, and the spikes will be forced to re-begin their cycle of regeneration. Now, of course, all of this is leading up to the spikes turning black. If you guys have never really fought Nergigante, and you're just curious about him, the way he works is you have a limited amount of time to break his spikes once they start growing, and after enough time has passed, they'll actually turn black. You'll see the tips of them begin to turn black, and as they work their way down, they turn all the way black. And once all of his body is covered in spikes, that'll be his head, forearms, wings, and tail. Once he's finished doing that, he's going to use a very powerful move. We're going to go over all the moves, of course, for Nergigante by the end of the video, but he's going to use his strongest move after all the spikes have turned black, so it's really in your interest to keep breaking them. See, it's kind of like this domino effect. If everyone on your team is able to keep his spikes broken, he never really gets to use his strongest move, right? There's exceptions to that, like if he makes it to his nest, for example. For the most part, you're given plenty of time to break his spikes in the regular part of the fight. And if your team can actually pull that off, you're going to have a very easy time against Nergigante. In fact, when I fight Nergigante solo, the funny thing is, he's actually easier than a lot of threat level 2 monsters when you're fighting him solo. But once you're in a group, so much more difficult for a number of reasons. People tend to split up, right? Or they, and that happens naturally, like they chase him, and then the people who didn't chase him, maybe somebody using a bow or a bow gun, they stayed in place, and then he has 2 spots to aggro between, right? And he tends to jump to one player, and then he jumps back to the other player. And the problem is, when he's doing that, it's very hard to focus on one part of his body. And what players tend to do in that group, they tend to attack all around his body, right? And I was explaining how the spikes actually grow where you damage him. So you can ignore parts of his body, and the spikes won't grow for a while. Well, on a team of 4, everyone just kind of attacks him, whatever they see, as soon as they can attack him, they attack him. So he ends up growing spikes all over his body, and nobody's really focusing on one part of his body. And he keeps turning his head because he keeps aggroing different players. See, these are the challenges you face in multiplayer. Again, it's a good idea to give him a status ailment, paralyze him, put him to sleep, something like that. But more importantly, try to withhold your attacks until you can get into a good position and then let them out. Focus on his head. His forearms are okay. Obviously, you're going to have to make the right combat decisions as you're playing, but if everyone on your team can just focus on one set of spikes and break them, you're going to be so much better off than if everyone just kind of wildly, randomly attacks any part of his body, right? So and that's kind of the message I'm trying to get forward with Nergigante before we move on to looking at all of his movesets so that you have a better understanding of how to dodge his moves, right? Now, one of the things I was really curious about, because since a big part of this game is just being able to break his spikes, I wanted to see if the part breaker skill would help break the spikes. And I tested it using a bow gun and normal shots, and I tested it over and over again. I would just count the number of shots it required to break the spikes. Part breaker appeared to have no effect at all. Each time it took the same number of shots to break his spikes. So I believe part breaker is not a skill you want to be equipping on your set. You probably just want to be equipping your strongest weapon, whatever weapon does the highest DPS. So when we're talking about builds for fighting Nergigante, we're not interested in being able to heal a team. We're not interested in being able to give the team defense. We're only interested in being able to damage Nergigante as fast and as hard as we can, because I think that's the only thing that affects whether his spikes break or not, is how much damage you're dealing. So the damage you deal is very important here, and you want to go all DPS versus Nergigante. And of course, like I said earlier, you don't want to be leading Nergigante away from your teammates. Make sure that if Nergigante is repositioning himself, don't just chase him. Look for your teammates, stay near your group. If everybody does that and Nergigante is forced to come to you, which he will, he's a very aggressive monster, you all have a better chance of focusing on one part of his body together. So do your best to bring your high DPS builds against Nergigante and stay together as a group. Don't worry about defense as much. Don't worry about healing as much. I mean, obviously do heal in the fight if you need to, but I mean, like, in terms of thinking about your builds, don't worry about, you know, being the guy with the sword and the shield who's giving everyone heals. You're not actually helping. You're allowing his spikes to turn black because your team needs your damage. You see what I'm saying? So if you're doing everything right, you're going to keep Nergigante very juggled. You're going to get two, flinches or staggers, whatever you want to call them, when you break each of his horns. When you break off his white spikes, you're going to get, he's going to become KO'd from that, which will, of course, allow you to focus on another set of spikes. And then finally, if you're focusing on his head with the blunt weapon, and as you can see, it gives a 3-star weakness to blunt weapons, all of those things are going to add up to keep Nergigante juggled the entire fight. It's going to be one of the easier fights in the game, but if everyone's split up and people brought like weird builds that don't focus on damage, you're going to see his spikes turning black. He's going to get to use dive bomb, which is always a high risk. The fight overall is going to take a lot longer. The longer the fight takes, the more attacks Nergigante is allowed to get away with, the longer the fight takes. So all those are, it's the difference between a very easy fight where all the dominoes kind of fell into place versus a very difficult fight where his spikes turn black and they deflect your moves and you don't really deal as much damage to him anymore, right? It's almost like dominoes in the opposite direction. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about the flash pods. In my original Tempered Elder Dragon guide, I said that you should be using your flash pods willy-nilly, just use them as much as you can. Well, they did an update, now the flash pods are limited. I believe you get 4 of them. And what you want to do with Nergigante is, when Nergigante wants to leave to another room, you'll want to fire a flash pod to stop him. When Nergigante, this is especially important, when Nergigante wants to start limping off to his nest, I definitely recommend using a flash pod at that point. So he's one of the Tempered Elder Dragons where you really benefit from stopping him from reaching his nest. Because once he gets to his nest, he's really annoying. He just kind of wastes a lot of your time. Like, first of all, you have to run all the way back to his nest. And sometimes that's a really long distance, depending on where you're fighting him when he starts to limp. So let's just say he makes it to another location on the map, right? And you know that the fight's really progressed past the halfway point. You really should have your flash pods equipped already at that point. You should be positioning yourself between Nergigante and his escape, so that when he begins to limp off, you can just put your weapon away, turn around, and flash him. This is all really important for saving you a lot of time. You can save a few minutes even. So once let's talk a little bit about his nest, right? So he runs all the way to the back, he goes to sleep. Of course, if he makes it back there and your whole team does not sleep bomb him, it just means you're not being a team player, or somebody on your team isn't being a team player, right? So you can, when it comes to sleep attacks, sleep bombing, right, you get to skip forward in the fight when you sleep bomb. Maybe sleep bombing even takes an extra 20 seconds. It's not that big of a deal though, because it's so easy to sleep bomb. It's the convenience and the ease of using it. So When he goes to sleep, make sure everybody's putting their mega barrel bombs down. And then when you wake him up, he's going to be very annoying in his nest. I guess the first thing I'll mention is to the side there's some little stalactites that fall down. These knock you back. They don't really hurt you too much. They're just an annoyance. Now that we've mentioned those are really the only environmental hazard. Nergigante will roar, jump into the air, and he's going to crash into 2 of the walls in his nest. And the problem is when he does this, he covers his whole body in white spikes. Okay, so once again, we're going back to this mechanic I talk about, where he appears to hurt himself, and because he hurt himself, or perhaps he did part break damage to himself, the spikes begin to generate. Well, in his nest, because he uses those wall-breaking attacks, it appears he gets spikes all over his body. And then, of course, you have to deal with another dive bomb, which, as I suggested earlier, is one of his most dangerous moves, and you're at high risk of having somebody faint if that happens, right? So, and in the nest, one of the walls he breaks down, you get 2 flash bugs, but those aren't even helpful anymore when we're talking about tempered investigations. If he made it all the way to his nest and you haven't actually used all of your flash pods at that point in the match, it's because you weren't being very efficient with the flash pods, right? So he just becomes nastier to fight in his nest. You don't want him to reach it. If he does, you want to sleep bomb him. After the sleep bomb, you just want to kill him as fast as you can and look out for his most powerful attacks. Okay, so now that we're done talking about, maybe strategies for fighting Nergigante, I really want to do a breakdown of all of Nergigante's moves. That's one of my new goals here. We're going to be working on a lot of monster guides that go into more details than the monster notes, and I feel like one of the things that's really important about learning a monster's moveset, so once you kind of have that moveset memorized and you kind of understand how to get around it, you really don't need as much defense as you once did, and that's really an important idea, because once you don't need as much defense, you're able to bring more offense, right? And that's what we want. We want more offense. That allows you to juggle the monster more often and end your fights faster, right? So I have a list of all of his moves accompanied with, a video that shows the move as well. And I'm just going to go down the list. Let's get started. Before we begin, actually, let me mention that these moves, they've been ordered by kind of like the least dangerous move to the most dangerous moves, right? They're not perfectly ordered. It's just kind of a general thing, but you'll notice the easiest ones are at the top. So starting us out, Nergigante has a move where he repositions himself. He likes to leap behind the player. He always tends to face the player, but yeah, he'll use this short little hop. And when he does, his legs tend to trip you. So if you get touched by his legs, you'll be tripped. It's very hard to avoid this move because there's no tell to it. He just does it very quickly, and it can be very annoying because it can interrupt, a charged move that you're working on or a combination that you're working on. Next, we have the Nergigante Roar. Of course, his roar doesn't actually do any damage to you, and, basically what it does is it wastes your time or interrupts your combos. He roars when he's going into enragement, right, when he's becoming enraged. He also roars when he's going to move off to a new area, and finally he does a roar on his hind legs when he's about to do a dive bomb. Next, Nergigante has a very light attack he uses quickly with his forearms, and this is a very simple move. It doesn't do a lot of damage, and once again, it causes you to trip. He can also do this with his head. It's kind of like a headbutt, right? He'll just do a very simple forward headbutt, and if the player gets touched by it, they'll be knocked on their butt. It doesn't deal a lot of damage, but it interrupts you, and so it's very annoying. Next, Nergigante has a wing attack where he uses both wings. He'll kind of dig them into the ground, and the thing is with this move, because it has such a long windup, you actually have plenty of time to get away from it. You can just get out of range of it, get away from them, or you can go under his belly as well. That's a safe place to keep attacking him from and not be affected by the wings. It's kind of an interesting move in the way that it has a lot of horizontal range. It appears to cause wind pressure, and it doesn't deal a lot of damage. Next, I want to mention the tail pound. So if you run behind Nergigante, of course, he seems to detect it. He'll lift his tail up and he'll pound it down into the ground. Again, this one doesn't really do a lot of damage. It's pretty obvious. He doesn't have a very thick tail, and because it's a very vertical attack, it's pretty easy to avoid it, actually. Alright, and here's one that's really not easy to avoid. This is what I'm calling his running shoulder charge. So what he's going to be doing is he'll start moving toward the player and he'll turn it into this, just kind of like shoulder tackle. It shoves him into the ground, and it's very hard to avoid this. Like, it's got enough of a hitbox range that you can't just roll left or right and avoid it. Then when we're talking about like just walking to the left or right, still that doesn't seem to be enough. You don't get a lot of a reaction time for it. If you were already walking the correct direction to avoid it, that'll help you avoid it. But, in terms of like consistency, this is a pretty low consistent move for being able to dodge it. And it actually does a decent little chunk of damage, and it can stun you, so it's kind of an annoying move. Then we have a move I'm calling the Heavy Shoulder Charge. Basically, Nergigante is going to detect that you're on the left of him or the right of him. He's going to fall down on his wing, and then he's going to kind of body slam into you with his shoulder. So that's the Heavy Shoulder Charge, and if you get hit by it, it'll knock you back pretty hard and actually deal a decent chunk of damage as well. Next, we have another kind of hard to avoid move. I'm calling it his Arm Sweep. A lot of monsters actually have moves similar to this. What it's meant to do is it's meant to clear the area right in front of him. You'll see him put his paw down on the ground, and then you'll just have a moment to get away from that. He'll just swipe it across in a big arc, right, like in a cone, right in front of his face. That's really meant to knock back melee players if they're not, if they're just kind of spamming on his head. You really have to notice him as soon as he lifts his arm and sets it down to his side. That's kind of the tell that he's about to use it, and you have to get out of the way of it, because if you don't, he's going to deal a decent chunk of damage and really knock you back. Alright, after that we have the Head Smash and the Arm Smash. These are two of his, I'm going to call them like his primary moves. You're going to see these a lot throughout the fight. And they're not actually too hard to deal with either. Basically with the Head Smash, what he's going to do is he's going to kind of lift up and shove his head into the ground. I imagine that would hurt, right? And if he has spikes on his head at the time, he'll actually launch a barrage of spikes forward in front of himself in a cone. What's easy about this move, though, is it's got kind of an obvious tell when he's going to be doing it, and all you really need to do is walk to his left or walk to his right. You got to kind of circle around him a little bit, and it's going to leave his head exposed, and you're going to be totally safe. If you're going to stay right in front of him, you're going to have to guard those spikes. And of course, if you're just going to guard the whole move, it costs a lot of stamina, so just keep that in mind. The Arm Smash works pretty much in the same fashion. I noticed he seems to have a few different animations for it. Sometimes he doesn't really, he'll stand up on his hind legs and really bring it down sometimes. Other times he'll just kind of shove his arm into the ground, and I'm pretty sure I've seen him not shove his arm into the ground at all, like just bring his fist down kind of thing, right? So he has a pretty simple forward arm smash, and again, like his head, if he has spikes on his arm when he does it, they tend to shoot off of his arm, so just be real careful with that as well. Both the Head Smash and the Arm Smash do a lot of damage. If you get hit by these moves, and again, they're more telegraphed than some of his other moves, it's really meant to punish you for not responding to them appropriately. Alright, we're moving on to the second most dangerous move that Nergigante has. I'm calling it the White Dive Bomb. So everybody knows Nergigante has a move that has been kind of called the Dive Bomb by the community. The Dive Bomb is when his spikes turn black, because you didn't break him off in time. He leaps up, and he comes crashing down in this crazy kind of like aerial shoulder charge. Well, the White Dive Bomb, he actually still has white spikes, and I believe he only uses this move when he's enraged, but he'll actually jump up in the air, just like he normally would for a dive bomb, except instead of doing a crazy shoulder charge, he uses a head smash. So he'll jump up, float in the air, and do a head smash down on the player. And it works just like the regular head smash, except I swear he shoots more spikes than normal, right? And I mean that like he'll shoot what appears to be like multiple waves of spikes. I'm pretty sure that's true. You'll be able to check on your own if you want. Just be aware that move, that's a one-shotting move. If you don't block that or get away from it appropriately, it will kill you. And it's much harder to get away from than his regular head smash, because wherever you're moving to, he's going to track that and fly down to it. That's what makes it so difficult. It's part of a dive bomb, right? So that's the White Dive Bomb. And then finally, you have the Black Dive Bomb, right? That's when he has black spikes, and we've talked about it a lot. He'll do a roar, and of course all of his spikes will turn black, and he's going to leap into the air. Now, to avoid this, I recommend using the dive evade. If you don't know what a dive evade is, and it's really important that you learn. Basically, let's go over it real fast. You're going to sheath your weapon, turn your back to the monster. This is what allows you to dive evade, and then you just need to dive at the appropriate time, and your character is going to kind of like Superman leap forward, and you get a very long invulnerability iframes for a while, right? So his move will totally miss you if you're doing the dive, and even people who haven't been targeted by him should be doing this, because he tends to he will shoot off a large cone of black spikes in all directions, and if you're close enough to it, it'll hit you for very high damage. If you can master diving away from the black dive bomb, you're going to be doing okay versus Nergigante. That's the biggest part of it. And if you're using a shield, you are required to use the guard up skill. If you don't have guard up skill, basically his move will go right through your guard. You might as well have not blocked at all. So, and if you're having trouble because you don't have the guard up decoration, and I know especially newer players definitely won't have the decoration, you can consider using the Uragan set. The Uragan set has a armor set skill that gives you guard up, so consider bringing that. That'll help you with being able to guard the dive bomb, right? And I believe the dive bomb is the only move that requires the guard up skill. Also, I want to mention one more of Nergigante's moves, which I realized I kind of forgot. He actually does, if you're far away from him and he's aggroed onto you, sometimes he'll do this really big leap into the air and come crashing down with his arm. He aims that very well, and it does deal a decent chunk of damage, and it knocks you back pretty hard. So kind of don't allow him to do that. Try to stay close enough to him that he doesn't use it. I'm just calling that his jump attack. It's not a true dive. He doesn't like lift into the air. He just jumps, right? Like a flea. He jumps across whatever distance you've been at. And it's a pretty dangerous move. It's pretty hard to avoid. It's especially dangerous to think about because sometimes players they'll get away from the monster because they need to heal. That's especially a dangerous moment, because if you get far enough away from him and you aggro him, he's going to use that jump attack and he might kill you with it, okay? So keep that in mind. Okay, so we've started out by talking a little bit about the physiology notes on Nergigante. We moved on to talking about damaging strategies and some of the more complicated mechanics with how Nergigante works. And finally, we talked about all of Nergigante's movesets. If you have some tips or tricks you'd like to share, be sure to leave those in the comment sections. As for builds, I would just go with whatever does the most damage in this case. He's not as complicated as some of the other monsters. I really think he's either the easiest Tempered Elder Dragon or the second easiest Tempered Elder Dragon, with Valhazak vying for one of those two positions, right? And we'll be doing Valhazak very shortly. Alright, well, if you enjoyed the video, consider sharing it with others so that they can learn as well. And I want to thank you all for watching.